Hello, hello. Good morning, folks. How are you doing, John? How you doing, Rosa?
I'm doing great. Rosa, Savannah, how you guys doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
I see the sunshine in Seattle, so it's whispering that it might be summer soon.
We
That's my good news for the day.
we got like a glimpse of it earlier this week. We had our first day here in Boston that was, over 70 degrees in the past maybe 7 months. So,
Yeah,
smiles on people's faces, feeling good. And, yeah, letting us see what's going to come, but it's not here yet.
It's a whisper of spring, which means it's time for spring cleaning, which is what we're talking about today. That was an
And
awful joke. Sorry.
today, and today, Steph is away, so you've got Savannah and myself here hosting the show. My name is John Massey, part of the optics team. I'm a principal optimizations solutions architect. And Savannah, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure thing. My name is Savannah Jensen. I am a senior FinOps success manager here on the optics team. And we have the absolute pleasure of having Miss Rosa Corley here with us today. Rosa, can you do a quick intro?
yeah, sure. So my name is Rosa Corley, and I am a FinOps commercial architect here at an optics team.
Yeah, this is a really special episode because we've got a number of folks from the optics team who are going to join us. And like Savannah mentioned, spring is in the air. We're going to be sharing some tips and tricks for spring cleaning within our FinOps environments and within our cloud environments. I'm not sure, Savannah. Maybe but are we maybe close to the record for like most amount of team members that have been kind of on the show, in one given episode?
I
Think
feel like we've got to be pretty close. Because it's what, six today? A lot of
yeah,
new faces.
yeah.
But Rosa's gonna be kicking us off. And as John mentioned, we're talking about spring cleaning, how to do cleanup, how to get rid of those things that don't spark joy in your AWS account, if you will. And Rosa, we know you've got a pretty exciting topic to chat through today. So do you want to start kicking us off and tell us what you're here
Sure.
to share?
Yeah, so I'm here to talk about how to clean up CloudWatch. So I know that is a very interesting topic because there's so much to do, but then sometimes you just don't know where to start. And I've had a lot of great success with a few of my customers on cleaning up CloudWatch. And one of the things that we've noticed when it comes to cleaning up, it's like, where do we start? How do we go about cleaning them up? And what do I need to pull up? And so we actually have a really good blog. It's called the CFM Tips. And I know Savannah will be sharing that shortly up on here. But basically, what we always kind of strive to do is like, what areas do you want to clean up? Like, for instance, log groups. Like, what log groups are out there that can be no longer used? And so when we ask the customer to go in there, like, okay, identify these log groups, do you have any retention period policies set up? And so that's like one of the first things, like, I've seen one of my customers gone in and actually apply retention period policies to their log groups and have been able to save a good amount of money regarding cleaning up those log groups.
So that's taking, our cleanup stuff and really automating this so that, we're not going back through and having to go through and maybe manually evaluate, log groups that we have set up. Just put the retention in, let CloudWatch take care of the rest, and kind of set it and forget it, right?
Right. And keep in mind that normally our default is to have it to never expire. So if there are certain type of log groups that you don't need them for a set period of time, just go ahead and apply them because one, it doesn't hurt, but it's setting that automation up and setting up governance and saying, okay, these specific log groups, let's go ahead and just make sure that they have that retention period on.
And Rosalie, you started to touch on this a little bit at the beginning, and I'm kind of curious. So, like talking about this from like a spring cleaning perspective, maybe I want to just go through and do that due diligence and check and look back and find out, are there opportunities to save? Is my retention in other places? How would you recommend someone kind of get started with maybe finding out if there's areas they should look a little bit more closely at, if there's areas to help, put the retention in place? I guess.
Right. So the easiest way to go about it is within the CloudWatch service. You can go in there and actually click on log groups. I don't have that up on my end, but in there you can go in and you can actually see the different log groups that show are there any retention periods set? So the majority of them, you will see it as a never expire, and you can just go in there and click on that log group and then be able to toggle it down. That would be the first method to go about identifying.
And I'm thinking about another one that you shared with me once before that was, using the CUR data to kind of look at like some of those top log groups. Maybe, I want to look at it across the whole organization, start looking at some of that, and then you can get those folks to kind of click in a little bit deeper and look at the retention settings and kind of look at some of those more specific configs that are in place.
Right. And you can definitely go in there. We have a CUR query library within the AWS website and be able to see what log groups are enabled to be able to apply that and see, okay, if that is like your highest spend, you can go into Cost Explorer too and just see like, okay, if log groups are my top spend, let's go into the CUR. Let's pull in that CUR query of seeing what all of the logs that you have available, and then be able to see, okay, what is that highest spend logs? Is this something that is continuously just collecting data and doesn't have any retention period?
Yeah, and you're mentioning something too that reminds me of something that we saw with another customer where they were looking at the log group data from within the CUR data and kind of plotting that, month over month, and looking to see if there's a pattern there. Was that capacity showing kind of the same storage month over month, and maybe a retention policy is in place, or are they seeing it just continue to kind of grow and grow and grow month over month? And maybe that's a sign that they should just go back through and kind of double check to see if there's
right. So I think that's a great call out, because there's two things that, like, when my customer did, one of their good wins that they had was one, they noticed that there was a log group that was just idle, and they actually went back not only on a 3-month period time frame, but they actually kind of pulled that CUR query data and was able to see like, hey, this is not growing, this has been stable, and there's nothing happening. Like, is this something that we still need to keep? Because there's nothing happening. And so it's an idled log group. And so they went ahead and said, well, you know what, we don't actually need this. Let's go ahead and delete it, or let's go ahead and bring it down to a smaller retention period, and went about it that way. We also found other ones where, oh, go ahead, Savannah.
We got a question in the chat that I think you're already kind of covering, but we've got one for, are there certain types of log groups we can focus on? And you covered the idle ones. Beyond that, is there anything else that you kind of see as like a sensible default or good place to start? And sorry if I interjected as you were finishing answering that question.
No, it's fine. Like, to me, I always like to look at the trend. So if it's not growing and if it's just there, I would go in back to that team and say, is this a group that we need? Is this a log group that we need? And if we don't need that, let's go ahead and just set that retention period policy down to like a 6-month time frame, and then see, okay, is it still, and if they even say, you know what, actually, we didn't realize we still had it there, let's go ahead and mark it for deletion. So I definitely like to look at that type of period of time of that activity. And if it continues to grow, then it's more about, okay, how long do we need to have that active?
Yeah, there's another piece that I'm kind of thinking about now too. Last November, we announced the infrequent access tier for the CloudWatch logs. I think we've got probably a link we could drop here in the chat for that, for folks to kind of dive in a little bit deeper. But it's another place where there's an opportunity to kind of look at what your use case is for the logs. Are these logs that you're expecting to interact with and kind of analyze, query against, look at, and explore? Or are these things that you're kind of keeping more for maybe a compliance reason? You may have to go back through and do some like forensic investigation down the road, but maybe less likely another place to save. So being able to dive in a little bit deeper into what the use case is, you could start to layer in some of these different cost levers to help save.
Yeah, and I would plus one to that. I mean, I think another great thing is, like, if you do need to use that infrequent access log class, which is a different option there, that is something that you might want to take a look into and seeing, okay, the normal standard is just to keep it, have all the great features that it comes with it. But if you want to go ahead and see what other, I don't really need a full extensive amount of logs to show me all these different features, let's go ahead and use the infrequent access log class. Mind you, you can't change that back. So if you are on that standard and you go to infrequent, you definitely want to start that. So any new logs that you have, definitely utilize that.
And just kind of a question for the audience right now. Feel free to kind of drop a response back in the chat. But I'm curious if folks are doing a lot of the retention standards kind of org-wide. Is that an organization-wide standard or policy, or is that something that individual teams have more control over and they get to dictate that, and have their own choice for putting that in place? So just curious if you all use, org-wide standards, or if that's something that's more team by team basis. Because we've been talking a lot about CloudWatch logs themselves, but the other side of this too is some of the other CloudWatch use cases. So stuff like get metric data and being able to pull out, metrics that we have within the environment. And that's another place where maybe we were grabbing more metrics at one point last year for a specific project. We needed, finer grain of detail coming back over in order to be able to understand the app. But if we don't need that anymore, that's another spring cleaning opportunity to go through and maybe reduce the polling frequency for getting metrics out, or just find out if there's a change in the needs that can help you reduce cost or reduce the amount of metrics that we're pulling back out.
Right. So if you don't need the detailed monitoring for all the different instances out there or auto-scaling groups, definitely make those changes out there just to kind of ensure that you're not continuously growing those metric counts.
Cool. We got a couple of responses over here in the chat. So I see Travis is saying it's team by team basis. So that's something where, there's always an opportunity to kind of look through and also find out what's working really well for teams and maybe help other folks dive in and see if, they want to make a change based on what's working well for somebody else. And I saw just one other response that we had over here too, that in the finance sector and kind of high compliance use cases that the retention policies are coming from, the powers above, right? So in those cases, maybe there's an opportunity to look at some of the other cost levers, stuff like the new IA tier that could help maybe reduce cost while still maintaining, a minimum retention period, but doing that in a more cost-effective way. So a couple different levers that are out there, and kind of really cool to hear how that can vary case by case for each customer.
Awesome. So I know we've got a lot to get through today. Rosa, do you have any final thoughts about what folks should do, or your top tip to go get some CloudWatch cleaning done before we let you go?
Don't be scared to tackle CloudWatch. Definitely use the cur. Look into those, even if it's a very high level, look at those retention periods, look at any unused alarms, anything that it's just still idle there. And trust me, you'll find some savings there with doing some good house cleaning there.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us today and talking about CloudWatch. I know sometimes it can be one of the more mysterious services to do cleanup on, but as you said, there are some pretty sensible defaults where folks can get started. So
thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rosa.
Bye.
All right, first transition down.
Hey.
We did it.
I like the little video. I know we chatted about it a little bit earlier, but it's nice. A little 5 seconds does go fast.
Yeah,
it does. Yeah. Well, Connor, thanks for joining us, and continuing on our spring cleaning deep dive. What do you got for us? What are we going to be chatting about?
Yeah, absolutely. Super excited to be here both. So thanks for having me. This prep, I started mowing the grass, cleaning the garage, a little spring cleaning of my own. But no, today, in all seriousness, we're going to be covering some S3 cleanup, right? Really, the way that I was thinking about it was kind of in 3 buckets. And these 3 buckets are just what I've seen customers kind of.
Wait, is that an S3 pun, by the way?
No, but very good. Very good catch. And really the 3 buckets that I've seen is obviously just cleaning up old data that customers aren't using anymore, right? Zombie buckets are just data that's old that really doesn't need to be stored on AWS anymore. Second, obviously, and I guess you could argue whether this is cleanup or not, but just best practices being intelligent tiering and lifecycle policies. And then last but not least, just incomplete multi-part uploads. I'd say in all 3 cases, it all starts with cost visibility. A lot of times I'm seeing customers start in Cost Explorer, just see, hey, what does our data split look like today? How much standard are we leveraging? We're leveraging intelligent tiering, et cetera. And then on the side of multi-part uploads, it's a little bit more storage lens focused, right? Diving in, understanding how many, I like the little comment there, understanding how many incomplete multi-part uploads they have in different buckets and really going from there. But in any case, a lot of what I've seen is it's been more of an initiative that's been kind of adopted by customer central FinOps teams, right? And then they're driving out and reaching out proactively to, you know, the individual application owners, bucket owners, and really going from there. In my experience, I've kind of seen, obviously, when you're just purging data that you no longer need, the zombie buckets in our example, that's where you're going to drive a ton of savings. And a lot of that is just quick conversations, right? It's not like there's a ton of work that goes into it. It's just, hey, who knows what this data is for? Are we still leveraging it? Do we need to retain it? So on and so forth. And then naturally, that's kind of the quickest and easiest way to clean it up. The second being intelligent tiering and lifecycle policies, maybe a little bit more work involved, particularly if you like know the access patterns, right? Then you're gonna have to do a little bit more analysis on, you know, put, get, request, the object size and the buckets to see really where it makes sense to go. One of the things that I've actually found really surprising, just in the customers I've worked with, is how often they go straight from standard to like GIR or Glacier Instant Retrieval. I'm curious, John and Savannah, from your perspective, if you're seeing your customers leverage this a ton. I think I've seen a ton of savings there, but that was one of the things that kind of just surprised me a little bit over these past couple of months.
I think once you kind of rip the Band-Aid off and stop using all standard, it is pretty common in my experience to see folks kind of take the plunge a little bit more. Because I think initially, like the first hurdle to get over, at least where I've seen, is okay, but we might need this. What if we put it in a different storage class? That seems scary. We don't really know what that is. And then once you try it out a little bit and they figure out that it's really not disruptive to their workflows and it's saving them a lot of money, we get a little bit more of that enthusiasm to kind of continue on that journey. John, is that similar to what you've seen?
Yeah. And I mean, I think depends a little bit on the use case, right? So we've got folks that, you know, have a really, really good understanding of what the use case is. And just, you know, kind of in our last segment talking about the CloudWatch logs, there are some compliance-based use cases where we know what the access pattern is. We're just storing the stuff indefinitely. And that can help us make that decision really quickly. And I think it just gets folks thinking more about access patterns. Well, what is what you're expecting from this bucket and the objects that you're storing there? And maybe that's a good place too. Like I saw a couple questions that are just kind of coming up in the chat around you know, the zombie buckets and kind of some of that terminology, because we have cold buckets that you know are kind of by design. But what do you mean, Connor, by like zombie buckets? You know, I'm just kind of curious. Yeah, go into a little bit more detail there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really good example, and this is one that I've seen pretty consistently across customers, is a customer will set up a single bucket for an old cur file that was created back in like 2019, 2020, never used anymore, not access for dashboards, not access to get queried anymore, just constantly collecting data that's never getting accessed, right? So quick and easy to clean up, but no risk to it. Just really just a perfect example of some spring cleaning for S3. That's a really good example that I'm seeing, particularly with customers who have, you know, a number of different cur files set up in their billing cost management console. That's generally, you know, a good place to start if you're going to investigate there.
Yeah,
especially if that cur is a new version every time instead of overwrite. Yeah. Those Great can get chunky if it's been a couple of years for sure. And it's kind of like nobody's thinking about it, nobody's using it. You're using a different cur. It's very insidious.
Exactly. And I think one of the good things too, like I said earlier, we're starting a lot of times with the central FinOps teams, helping them kind of drive this initiative internally. And a lot of times those teams are the ones who actually own those buckets with old cur files. So you can immediately get a quick win, cascade that to the rest of the org, and then it just helps build a little bit of momentum, right? I'd say that's kind of what I've seen be most successful with my customers is start with a small sample size, immediately get a quick win, then you can cascade it, right? It's like the 80-20 rule. Put 80, like all your effort into where you're going to get 80% of your savings. And generally you're going to see some pretty good results there. Then, oops, sorry, John, you had something?
Well, no, I was just kind of thinking out loud here that, you know, I think going back to like, you know, different patterns like dormant buckets, zombie buckets, types of things like that. You know, Rosa mentioned in the last section around like kind of how to get started. And I think one thing that we've seen work really well for customers on the S3 side is just looking at that list of all your buckets, looking at the capacity that you have in there, what you're spending on it, and saying, does anything here surprise you? And if it does, you can dive in deeper. But you know, just looking for what's going to pop out at you. That's like kind of a good place to get started. What's, you know, taking you by surprise the first time, you can use that as a place to dive in a little bit deeper.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And honestly, like a couple of metrics I always look at are resource level ID. A lot of this data you're going to get out of Kerr, right? Resource level ID, so just bucket name, percent of that bucket in standard storage, and then out of that, what are the put and get requests looking like, right? That's a quick and easy way just to get a high level sense of, hey, are we accessing this a lot, or is it just, we're just constantly putting data here?
I will say too, the new Cost Explorer features that I guess aren't that new because they've been around for 6 months now, but they're still new to me. Make that a little bit easier too. If you're not well versed in the Kerr, we do have the ability to toggle on that resource level data, so you can take a look at those bucket names that way too. But yeah, completely agree with you, Connor. You have to know what's there before you can really measure it.
Exactly.
I'm also loving the amount of speculation on what zombie buckets means in the chat. Perfect.
Yeah.
Chewing up funding.
That's good.
Hungry for your dollars, not for brains.
That's good.
Now that's a great tagline. That's that one needs to continue on. Then I saw this too. Where can I see the put and get requests against the buckets? Connor, any comments on that? You mentioned a couple of them kind of at the beginning.
Yeah, definitely. I guess not to get too in the weeds, but the way that I've always done it is leveraging cost and usage report. I think it's just an easier way to get a lot of information, and you can look back pretty obviously historically, whereas I know Cost Explorer is a little bit limited there. The way I've done it is obviously you want to pull in your resource IDs, which is going to give you your bucket name. And then the way I've also done it is just pulling in, I believe it's like line item operation. It is the field that I look at, right? And that's going to give you your put and get requests. And then you can start to map them back and also look at the buckets that are very heavily leveraging standard storage. I know there's Kerr Query Dictionary. I know we have that link there that we could probably send that could be helpful, at least for that question. But that's the way that I've done it. And then it's a good way to just start conversations, right? You don't want to make any decisions or actions without talking to people who own the buckets. But I think it's really good just to at least have these data points when you're going to start those conversations with the team.
Yeah, and if you have the resource IDs being pushed out to the Kerr, or like Savannah mentioned in Cost Explorer with the new resource ID support, the resource ID, which Connor mentioned earlier, is the bucket name. So we can really reconcile that with like a human readable identifier, and then Kerr and Cost Explorer are both going to give us the ability to track used capacity, but also the API requests. So get and put requests, both the API requests that get metered within the Kerr, we can look at those and reconcile them. And then if you're looking for, something natively in the console, you can also do this with Storage Lens. So with Storage Lens, everyone gets a free default dashboard. It's going to share usage metrics on the buckets, things like stored capacity, the storage class that they have. And there's an option for flagging on activity metrics that are paid metrics that we could bring back in. And this lets you create customized dashboards that can show not only get and put requests, but go a little bit deeper, show things like retrieval percentages, all the other stuff you'd want to use for identifying the spring cleaning opportunities.
Absolutely.
What one, just like sort of a tip and trick there too, that I always like to kind of call out that I think is good for spring cleaning stuff, where we could turn that on for just like a day or two and get a lot of data and a lot of insight out of it. Don't have to run it for, a long period of time. If you're going to use some of those paid metrics too. So it's just a little pro tip there.
Awesome.
All right. Any last big tips before we swap you out, Connor?
I think last big tip is make sure you're just staying on top of your data, better understanding it. So many times customers, their feedback is, hey, I wish we looked at this 6 months ago. Yes, 6 months ago would have been awesome, but today's the second best day. So that's all. Stay on top of it, keep monitoring, and you'll be good to go.
Yeah. And if you don't know what it is and you can't figure out what it is, maybe it's time to put that in a deeper storage tier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, John and Savannah, thanks for having me on. Great to join you.
Thanks for joining us, Connor. And that's a good reminder too. Stay on top of it. I got to apply that to just my general spring cleaning and make it a little less intimidating. But yeah, thank you very much, Connor. And we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Talk to you all later.
Scottie, how are you?
Welcome.
Doing well. It's great weather here. We got NBA playoffs starting. Life is good, everything's great.
Does spring really have the same meaning in LA?
It's
Are you
pretty
guys
much the same,
excited
yeah.
about that?
You know, we have been getting a lot of rain as of late, and you know, it kind of clears up the smog and everything afterwards. So it has kind of felt a little bit different this spring because everything looks like really bright and clear. So a little bit of, you know, variance in our weather.
Scottie, I was also going to say, it feels like you're flexing on us a little bit because I generally hide my room from behind me because it is a disaster zone. And I feel like you're flexing, showing that you've already done your spring cleaning in your house because it looks spotless.
Thank you.
So,
I
very
appreciate that. Yeah. So I live in a one-bedroom apartment. I have 600 square feet all to myself, and I keep it pretty clean because I don't know. I'm like the type of person that, like, when my apartment is a mess, and that's also my office, like I can't focus on anything. So I'm just in perpetual cleaning because, you know, I got to stay focused on these cost savings.
I think that is a good takeaway too. You know, getting some of the backlog of savings opportunities addressed, you know, does help you, and maybe just not be quite as distracted by that, and not maybe let your mind run and say, hey, we got to do X, Y, and Z for, you know, clean up within the cloud environment. We could focus on, you know, these other areas, or focus on, you know, putting governance in place to protect this stuff. So kind of getting through the clutter first and then being able to kind of move on to the priorities is it's a good takeaway.
Yeah, 100%.
So Scottie, what are we going to be kind of walking through from your angle on the spring cleaning? What do you like to do? What don't you like to do? What's what are you bringing to the AWS keys to optimization crowd today?
Yeah, so I have two services I'm going to touch on. The first is going to be EBS Snapshots. So, fun fact, I think it was like a year and a half ago. I led I think it was like 3 hours, John. I know you were on that, the workshop just about cleaning up EBS Snapshots and like finding opportunities. So I'll start with EBS Snapshots. Obviously, not going to have the same amount of detail as that workshop we did, but maybe we can do a separate episode of Twitch later on just about that. But EBS snapshots are kind of an interesting topic. And the reason why I like to bring them up is because of the way the billing works, right? So with many of our services like S3, for example, you can just kind of go in the cur and take a look at a bucket, and it's directly tied to the amount of data that you consume. EBS billing is, or excuse me, EBS snapshot billing is a little bit unique in that you're actually only billed for what are called billable blocks. So if you take a snapshot of an empty volume, there's nothing to back up. So you're not billed for that snapshot. And then if you start writing some blocks to that, then you're going to introduce what are called billable blocks. And that's what you're actually billed for. Where it gets even more interesting is when you're in that same lineage and then you take another snapshot, the EBS snapshot service is really smart about not duplicating data. So if there's duplicated blocks in a later snapshot, you're actually not billed for those. Those are what are called reference blocks. And I did share a really good reInvent talk from a couple of years ago that kind of breaks that down in a little bit more detail. But, you know, I would say if you're looking to clean up EBS snapshots, the number one thing that I would start with is make sure you understand the billing and the cost visibility aspects. Surprisingly, what's actually better, in my opinion, is to use the describe snapshots API as opposed to any of the cur data, because you're able to get a lot of really cool metadata from that. So namely the start time, which you can also query by to say, let me just have the snapshots that are, say, older than a year from now. And then you can also pull descriptions out of there. And typically whatever service is generating the snapshots, like AWS Backup, for example, will put a nice description inside of the free text field there. So what you can do is start to put together these really cool histograms that I've done for a lot of customers, where it's like, this is your snapshot usage over time. This is the stuff that's older than a year. And then we can start to group it by environment, by what created it, to start to get more detail there. So lots of really cool opportunities there. But like I said, my two tips there, definitely go ahead and make sure you understand how snapshot billing actually works. How do the snapshot mechanics work? From there, understand that you kind of need to merge that API data from the describe snapshots to get the metadata. Typically join that with something like cur data, and then use that to sort of tell the full story about your snapshot costs, and then decide, hey, do we need this? Does this match the retention policy? And if you've ever been on a call with me where I'm talking with, talking about snapshots with customers, that's always what I say. You know, does this match the retention policy? Is the fundamental question that you can start to answer with all of that put together.
So that's kind of going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with, CloudWatch and storage is, you know, you got a lot of data here. You can look at that and start to see like, hey, is there any surprises here that maybe I want to click into a little bit deeper? Or, I think Rosa was talking about this a little bit earlier too, where get ahead of things. And maybe if you're having a hard time now, kind of reconciling the usage because the labels aren't there or it's hard to match that stuff up, maybe that's something you want to prioritize for this year to make it easier to kind of go through and revisit this next year, or next time we go back through and look at the data, we'll have, more there to create those cool histograms or create more visual plots to understand the usage patterns.
Yep, for
Scottie,
sure.
I'm curious about your experience of kind of implementing this in practice. I know sometimes when we go through with a customer and try to kind of work on S3 or a specific service, sometimes there's one team that's like the main consumer that really needs to do most of the cleanup. Is that common with snapshots too, or is it more across the board that everybody's got some cleanup to do?
Yeah, it definitely depends on the customer types. I would say more often than not, there's folks that could clean up across the board, right? And other metrics that I'll look at too is, there's not a prescribed percentage, but one thing I'll typically look at is what is your ratio of EBS spend to snapshot spend, right? Because if you notice that you're 80% snapshots and 20% spend, unless you have really hardcore retention policies, it's very likely the case that you may just have not set those properly, or you have like a lot of old snapshots there, or you're not using something like DLM or backups to like clean that up. And so that's typically, one of the things that I look at there. Usually in my experience though, given the prevalence of EC2 as a service, usually snapshots are pretty distributed as well.
Awesome. And I know you mentioned you wanted to cover something on RDS as well. Is it time to pivot to that?
Let's pivot to RDS. So I've got a few quick hitters. So number one is if you do have a trusted advisor enabled, which I believe requires the enterprise support, take a look at the idle RDS checks. I definitely should have made sure to research exactly what it is, but if I remember correctly, it's the instances that don't have a connection within the past 14 days. So a pretty good idle detection mechanism there to double check that you need those. The second piece that comes to mind is going to be using Instance Scheduler. So one thing that I look at very, very commonly with customers is when I'm taking a look at some usage with them is going to be that breakdown of production versus non-production spend. Because typically for a lot of reasons that non-production spend is going to be a lot easier to clean up, right? Like there's not risks of outage. They're typically lower environments. A lot of times they can be turned off. So my pro tip there is if you have a linked account that is non-production, what I'll do is I'll filter to just the RDS running hours using the usage type group within Cost Explorer, and then set the granularity to daily. And ideally what you should see is if you are turning things off on like nights and weekends, you should probably start to see some drops at that daily grain. And then obviously if you need more granularity, you can use the cur to get down to hourly. If it's perfectly flat and it's non-production, typically that's a good opportunity to use something like Instance Scheduler to turn off those instances when you don't need them. And kind of rounding out that first point, and then I'll see if y'all have any questions, is the other thing that I'll check while I'm there is if you change then the grouping to the usage type and in Cost Explorer, you can see what's multi-AZ or multi-AZ cluster. That's also another cleanup that I've noticed a lot of folks do is in lower environments, you probably don't need multi-AZ, you probably don't need that standby. So that combination of, I'm looking for that usage that's perfectly flat in non-production accounts at a daily grain. And then I'm also seeing, again, in those non-production accounts, are you leveraging multi-AZ or multi-AZ clusters, and kind of seeing if you actually need those, considering that it's a lower environment.
One thing I've heard folks mention too is with the kind of toggle on and off and spin up, spin down in lower environments, sometimes they get an added resiliency benefit in kind of their development processes because they have the ability and kind of the practice of spinning down and spinning up. So little added bonus outside of the cost sphere that you can think about too, if that's something that's important to your business.
Yep. And the one thing I'll say before about this and the last topic that I have, which is going to be Graviton, is definitely make sure that if your organization purchases RIs,
Mm.
definitely talk to folks there to make sure that you're not going to go underutilized on those, because that would impact the cost savings, right? If you sort of already paid for these instances that are running 24/7, right?
Absolutely. That's a great call out, Scotty, for sure.
Awesome. And then my last quick tip is definitely going to be Graviton. So I think we've talked about Graviton on this show before, but for folks that don't know, Graviton, of course, is our ARM chips that we manufacture. And it's super easy to adopt for managed services to get some quick savings, particularly for RDS. We'll include a couple of links in here around the version requirements. So what I'd say is if your version of RDS or RDS Aurora supports Graviton, particularly in lower environments where there can be that brief outage while you migrate over the instance type, definitely just go ahead and kick that over to Graviton for some quick savings there. And keep that in mind before you purchase any new RIs as well, right? Even if it is a production workload, we love to see customers take that pattern of, terminate idle instances, use Instant Scheduler in lower environments, migrate to Graviton, and then finally purchase RIs, right? So that if you don't skip any of those steps in the middle, then you're able to, save the most money and not have any risks of underutilization.
And Scotty, you kind of hit us with the lightning round there with a lot of awesome detail. I want to take a pass at recapping and let me know if I missed anything here. But sounds like if folks are kind of getting started with like the RDS spring cleaning, two things that they can do to kind of like directionally figure out a good place to start. One of them is look at the trusted advisor data. Maybe you've got some, idle database instances, and that can help you kind of zero in on a couple of places where maybe those aren't being used anymore. Maybe, they're part of a non-prod environment where that's, a pattern that just happens to reoccur. And then kind of reevaluate that. So that's one place to start. The second one is to look at the daily elasticity of some of the instances as well, especially if they're in non-prod, and say, hey, are these ever spinning down? And you can go ahead and you kind of look at that on a daily grain from within Cost Explorer as a way to, start to filter that out and look for some pockets of opportunity to kind of further evaluate. And then you can go through and start looking at, all these different avenues for saving where, evaluate, purchase options that are already there for any of those databases. Are they running on demand? Take that into consideration if there's RIs that are covering them. Look at Graviton, look at multi-AZ configurations. And anything else that we missed there?
No, that was an excellent summary.
Okay, cool. So a lot of good places to start. And I think what's cool about that too is that not necessarily just one remediation you have to do. Maybe of those three that you kind of mentioned there, maybe one, maybe two, maybe all of them are options for going through and kind of helping to do some cleanup. So that's cool having a couple options there to work through.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, Scotty, and just telling us all the hacks.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, y'all.
Yeah. Thanks, Scotty. We'll talk to you soon. Adam.
Hey, John.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I think this is a perfect chance for us to say, hey, talked about a lot of different topics, a lot of different optimization levers that are out there for all these different services. And Adam, you're going to kind of bring us through like, okay, got a lot of different stuff out there. How do you start to group this? How do you start to, build a list and, tackle that chore list? Is that a fair way to put it? Did I capture that right?
Yeah, I think you did. The way you characterize that is the way I kind of look at this, right? There's tons of different things to go after, but how do you prioritize any of that? That's probably similar to like what you'd experience when you're doing actual spring cleaning, right? Do you start in the garage, the messy desk, your closet? Like, which part's going to give us the most benefit? So when I was doing optimizations for my customers, we ran into that same deal. I'd pull all this information together, I'd turn it over to them, and then it was kind of their decision on where to start. And that was helpful to them, but I noticed oftentimes they get kind of stuck there and figuring out where to go next. So I created a report that I call the High Five report. And it's just a simple single-page report that shows my customers the top 5 idle resources they have in 3 different categories. And I did it to make it very digestible, just simple, shows the actual resources with the description of what they are, why they're idle, and it makes it actionable for either a customer that wants to take it and give it to the engineers to say, go fix these things, or just a simple report that rolls up to an exec that can say, okay, wow, we've got some cleanup to do. There's some big savings in a very small amount of things that we could go after.
The idle piece of that, I feel like, is always such a good place to start too, because if it's idle and unused, it's a very easy cleanup most of the time. When you're looking at this stuff across your customers, are there any frequent flyers that you see on there that are common between organizations?
Yeah, there was, and that was kind of the basis of why I picked kind of the 3 categories, and I'll talk about them, I guess, a little bit in each piece. But I've seen optimizations across dozens of categories, but when I started looking at it through the lens of what can we save versus how much effort are we going to have to put in, if you imagine kind of putting those on the graph, I wanted to give them the highest savings, lowest effort stuff. I wanted it to be the no-brainer things that you could surely just go and at least turn off, or have a discussion with the team and say, hey, this appears to not be doing anything. And with that in mind, that gave me kind of like a focus to start pulling stuff together. And the one big bucket that I see is in EC2.
Mm-hmm.
So within EC2, I look at idle EC2 instances. And Savannah, if you end up wanting to drop the link in, feel free. But inside of Cost Explorer, there's a right sizing recommendations piece that I like to use, because it has a threshold that looks for instances that have a maximum CPU utilization of 1% or less for the past 14 days. This is a very, very stringent bar, right? This instance isn't doing anything. It's not doing updates in the background. Nobody's connecting to it. That instance is just sitting there completely idle. So I like to use that check. If you do go and use that check, I also uncheck the underutilized instance box, and I uncheck the include savings plan and reserved instance box. So here's why I do those 2 things. The underutilized instance checkbox is more for the instances that are say 10% or less an average utilization, similar to what you would get in Trusted Advisor. And those are valuable, but those are more of a right sizing recommendation, not a true idle, let's go get rid of this recommendation. So for that reason, I leave the underutilized uncheck and I just check idle. And then the include savings plan and reserved instances, I get rid of that too, because if it is being covered by some kind of commitment, I don't want to hide that instance, right? I'd rather know that it's an idle instance is being covered by a commitment, because I want to go get rid of it. And I'd rather that commitment go apply to something else that's either running, or maybe I'll see that commitment is going underutilized and I have capacity to go apply somewhere else. So I really like that check. I think you could get similar data out of our tool like Compute Optimizer. They've added in some things recently where you can adjust the headroom and thresholds so that you can kind of choose your own adventure, right? Pick where you want to set that bar and go after those instances. But for just the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, the place that one component of my report is the idle EC2 instances.
Absolutely. I think that report in Cost Explorer is so powerful for FinOps folks too, especially if you're just getting started. Cost Explorer and all the reports contained in it are usually pretty familiar and pretty kind of easy to access for folks who maybe haven't stuck a toe outside of the cost suite. So lots of really great data that's super powerful, just available there already.
I agree. And I think it's easy to pull that data, right? And you see this report and okay, now I've got hundreds of instances. What do I do, right? I sort them biggest dollar amount to least, and then we're just looking at the top 5 in my case. But if, for your organization, 5 is even too many to go after, start with the top 1. And if you knocked out 1 per month for the next, year, you still made progress toward getting some of that cleaned up. And John, I think I cut you off.
No, was just going to bring up this question because I think it was topical to exactly where you're going with this. And the question was, what do you do when they ignore the list of optimizations? And what I'm kind of hearing from you, Adam, and what I've seen with your approach is that if you give someone that whole list, it's got thousands of things in it. Even though there's a lot of different options, it can almost be harder, for someone to take action, easier to ignore because it's overwhelming, or maybe you already know why, one of those things is the way it is. Maybe it's by design, right? But if you start to whittle it down and you just show a couple different options there, and you've done things like you just described, where maybe you're focusing on idle instances where there's fewer technical considerations, makes it easier for someone to, take action on it and, go through and remediate. So narrow the scope, make it easier for someone to, be able to look at that and evaluate it, and then, remove some of the considerations that make those things hard for someone to act on. But I'm curious, just your response to that same question about what do you do if someone's ignoring, optimization recommendations that are being shared?
So firstly, I think you captured the one big piece was to make it more digestible, to give just a smaller list, because it can be overwhelming when you get that list of hundreds or thousands of instances. The second thing I do though is I annualize the number, which basically shows them, like, if you leave this idle thing out there and it just sits around for the next year, it's going to cost us this amount. And that makes the impact a little higher than if it were just seeing like monthly or even hourly, right? Hourly can look like a much smaller number to run an instance, but as you expand that out, it certainly adds up over time. And then from a rebuttal perspective, I do like to have the conversation to find out, okay, like why, right? What's preventing us? Because there tends to be less rebuttals for these idle things because they're sitting out there doing nothing from what we can tell. So at the very least, I suggest to them, like, if you're worried, like, we don't have to delete the instance, right? At least turn it off so that we're not getting the hourly billing for the instance anymore. And then we can reassess, or maybe this was built ahead of time for a project that's coming up in a few weeks, and that's their rebuttal, right? Well, we need to keep it, like, we're launching this in 3 weeks. There still may be, a reason to, okay, well, let's turn it off for now, and then in 2 weeks or 2 weeks and 6 days before the launch, right, like, then we can turn it on and get it going. So I try to have that conversation so that it can disarm it, because I think oftentimes those teams can write off things as, oh, well, we can't. And without knowing the reason why they can't, then we'll never really make any progress forward.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a big theme with a lot of cleanup, is asking that why question. And if a team has a good answer, like a very genuine, solid answer to that why question, great. Then I don't think that's necessarily something that we really pressingly need to clean up. But more often than not, there isn't an answer to that why question, or it takes them kind of some research and we can get to a solution that involves kind of either pausing, doing some cleanup, and reducing those costs. So super critical.
I haven't seen a great answer to the idle ones because they appear to be doing nothing.
Right.
I have seen great answers to ones that I would suggest right sizing, because sometimes I've had customers come back and say, well, the vendor we're using says that if we don't use this exact instance size and type, they won't support us, right? Like, that's the one that they recommend would be, most functional. In that case, okay, then you need to have a conversation with the vendor and make sure that still makes sense, and if they have new guidance. Moving ahead then, I guess, for the sake of time, the second kind of chunk of the report that I produce is idle RDS. And Scottie talked about that, a little bit here, where it's databases that haven't had any connections over the last minimum 7 days up to 14. And I see this pretty often as well, and this can add up to big dollars, because these, are usually databases that are either, again, built ahead of a project that's being launched down the road, or they're databases that were built at one point that appear to no longer be used. And the same recommendation, lands here, right? Like, can we at least shut it down, just turn it off? Whether you use Instance Scheduler or you do it manually, right? Like, it's just a small list. Like, let's at least go turn it off and stop paying per hour. And then can we talk to that team and evaluate if this could be snapshotted and terminated, or, what's our next step? So the RDS ones oftentimes can be a substantial dollar or savings opportunity for extremely low effort.
Absolutely. And do you see a lot of that occurring in kind of those lower test dev environments too? Or is that more spread across everything in your experience?
Yeah, surprisingly, I've seen it as in a mix, right? Like, I thought it would be all like dev, QA, non-prod accounts where people just spin up things that they're testing and then kind of forget about them. Like, that made the most sense. But it's not uncommon for me to see them in prod environments where they built what was going to be the production database, but then it ended up being a different one, and then that one got kind of orphaned or forgotten about. And that makes sense, right? When you're in an environment with thousands or hundreds of thousands of resources, like, to keep track of everyone that's being used and that had some project maybe changed and that resource is now gone unused, that can absolutely be a task. I think that's why these trusted advisor checks, or even third-party tools that check these kind of things, can be super valuable, because we want to be staying ahead of keeping these items cleaned up so that so that really our customers, and that's my goal, that our customers are only paying for what they're using. Like, I don't want them to be paying for things that are out there sitting and giving them no value.
Awesome. Awesome.
And then the third bucket in the report, and again, so there's just 3 sections, right? 5 items in each section, is unattached EBS. So within Trusted Advisor, we have a check called underutilized Amazon EBS volumes. It's a great check, but it's currently like an aggregate check where it looks for volumes that are either unattached or they're attached and have had less than 1 IOP for the last 7 days. So to me, from an effort perspective, those are 2 very different things. It's either a volume that's still attached to a running instance that doesn't appear to be used very much, but it's still attached. That's going to take some effort to track down that instance owner, to go find out if that volume is still being used, to maybe get it unattached. So what I do is I just filter this list for solely the unattached volumes. And generally, I see these as volumes that have either been orphaned after an instance has been deleted, or they're volumes that are being retained, for some kind of compliance or legal reason, that are just hanging out there in case they need it, in the future. And for either of those reasons, I think it's important to evaluate them, because with EBS, you're paying, per gig that you've provisioned, per month. So that cost is going to exist. And if it isn't actively being used, I really want to understand, well, why is it not? When might we need it, if we're even going to need it? And then can we just snapshot it or put it in snapshot archive, and then it's out there if we need it, but we're not paying that same price per hour as if we were to, have kept it around, in that normal state.
That's a great call, and I think this does a couple things. It helps to isolate some of the specific remediation processes.
The last bit I'll add here, I guess. You go ahead, John.
I think your internet had a bit of a hiccup, but I think. Oh, go ahead.
No, it was just kind of bringing it home there from like both the tech side, Adam, of being able to like identify the opportunities, and then to this like kind of organizational, more like operational approach side of like make it simple, make it easy. And I saw one of the comments from Eric was communication, right? And that's where I think reducing that scope down is super helpful. So I'm curious if folks in the audience would love to hear kind of next week, following weeks, like is this something that you had a chance to try? How did it go for you? Did you do anything different with it? I think that's a really cool approach.
Yeah. And I know we've covered a lot, and we've got a couple minutes left. So I think it's time for the Secret Richard recap. For folks who don't know, we've got Secret Richard, who is summarizing everything. And this is the first time that we see his summary. Utilize IA to avoid stockpiling expensive logs.
Beware our zombie buckets. Snapshots. Do they match the retention policy? And last but not least, narrow the scope of optimization opportunities. I think, that those are just like fantastic call outs. And just a great way to get started with everyone's spring cleaning. So that was fantastic.
Absolutely. Anything that you can do to remove that analysis paralysis is, I think, key. And Adam, the report and kind of the approach that you're describing is spot on for that. Keep it simple, keep it super actionable. And especially if it's a report that you're delivering month over month, it'll be really easy to see if there are trends, or if there's a frequent flyer that's just always at the top of that report. If you haven't deleted one of those instances, it's a lot easier to see in real time how much it's costing. So love to hear that actionable strategy for sure.
And one thing that's been helpful too is to audit, right? When you have a very small list, it makes it easier to go check what's been cleaned up. So I'll each month run even a query against that and go see, have these items, been remediated? Even if the team said they took care of them, am I seeing them still billing? So if they are, then maybe they haven't. And, and I've run into that in one particular case where a customer said, oh yeah, we took care of all those unattached EBS volumes. And the person I was working with, I said, well, I'm still seeing them billing. Can you double check with them?
Did you?
And they went back. And they went back and asked them. They said, well, we snapshotted them and we were going to delete the volumes, but we forgot to do that step. So they were now paying for volumes plus a snapshot.
Follow through,
Yeah. Yeah, that's great
That's
too with the
important.
way that you kind of forecast it out on an annualized basis. Because if you catch something in January, you can really trend and say, well, we've saved 11 months of this, and then kind of keep moving down the line and tally the potential savings there, which is great. I feel like that's such a good way to encourage folks to kind of keep the momentum going when you put a dollar to it and you see those savings keep on ticking up and ticking up. So,
And for those that have had environments for years over years, like there could be idle,
oh, yeah.
you know, resources in there for much longer than that even. So I think it's important to stay on top of them and proactively go after that type of stuff.
Spring cleaning happens every year. Can even happen every month if you're really on top of it.
It is ongoing. It is, yeah, it is decluttering. It is, you know, helping to plan for the next one. Yeah, I think it's, yeah, all of the above. And I think, as always, like, we're really interested to hear, you know, what kind of success stories folks have. So definitely share them. Savannah, do we have our email address? Yeah, here.
Yeah. And I think we've got a really good question in the chat to wrap us up. I know we're coming to the end here, but lightning round. Do you have any crazy stories of something small that saved a ton of money in AWS?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. Like I've seen single instances or single databases saving customers, you know, 50 to 60 grand a year, right? Just for like
Wow.
one item. And mind you, you know, it's big instance or big database, but it's amazing to me that to see that like one resource can be cleaned up that could potentially, you know, fund a headcount or something in, you know, in somebody's environment, right? So, you know, that may not be, you know, as crazy as some of the huge savings, obviously, that we work on at scale, but when you know, zoom down to just a single item and be able to save that amount is really amazing to me.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Adam. Always great to chat. Thanks so much for sharing. And thanks to all of our guests today to talk us through how to spring clean. John, any last words? Or?
No, that's all we got. So look, I think we'll have Steph back next week, and just want to say thank you to everyone again, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, folks.